we go.
Good noon, everybody. I hope you're all doing well and have got a chance to get some food. There's probably going to be a little bit more left over, and so if you need more during this presentation, feel free to do so. We were really lucky last spring. Lisa Ross-Stevens reached out to me and said, hey, would First Pres be willing to host International Peacemaker? And as always, when offered these opportunities, I said yes, of course. And so it is through Lisa's efforts to have this presbytery be part of this program for as long as it has been or would go along that we have today Francis Namoumou, who many of you saw in worship with sort of an introduction to some of the challenges that have been going on in Oceania, and rating in some of the things complications that are going on. We thank her for her work with the Pacific Conference of Churches and spreading the word about what it is like to be a person living in and a Christian living in these places where a small amount, things that we hear and don't think of as very big, climate change can really do a lot of damage. We thank her for preparing all this stuff, for coming to us at the end of this month of her travels, even in the midst of exhaustion, physical and mental, going through different communities to us today. So I present to you Francis Namoumou, and really lean into the microphone. You can move the microphone, it's fine, we can help you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that introduction again, plus also the opportunity to at least show some context from the Pacific. They always say save the best for last, so while this is the last place, maybe the last day for me to do this presentation, I'll try and be very informative and answer questions afterwards if the need arises. So again, as was explained in my presentation earlier in the service, the title of this presentation is Singing the Lord's Song in Strange Lands and Times, based on our strategic plan for the last five years, specifically to demonstrate that there are communities moving, not only because of climate change, but after COVID, there was a wave of migration for work purposes to Australia and New Zealand from communities around the region. So I said at the service, Bula Vinaka. Bula Vinaka is our greeting word, so when I say Bula Vinaka, respond Bula Vinaka. Bula Vinaka, everyone? Bula Vinaka. It simply means great health and great life to you all. And as we greet people, I think for us it resonates very deeply because every word we speak, we feel the mana or the spirit that goes to the person or to those that are receiving them. And because I work with the Pacific Conference of Churches and we're based in Fiji, and later on in this presentation I will focus on two case studies that we did in Fiji on migration, climate-induced migration. A lot of the discussion in my presentation will focus specifically on Fiji, but I'll try and every now and again bring up other aspects from the rest of the region. I said in the service that I use an upside-down map to situate Fiji in the map, in the world map, but also to give a different context regarding the ocean. The ocean in this upside-down map signifies the interconnectedness we have. It brings to light that whether you are in Africa or anywhere else around the world, we're connected by the ocean. This is the United States, that's Fiji, circle, the small circle up there. And all around Fiji are other Pacific Island countries. I said, if we were to clear the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, we're neighbors, we could drive to each one of these islands. But really it also implies that when things are happening in the global north or anywhere else around the world, it would somehow reach us or affect us in the global south. And if something happens in the global south, at some point it would affect those in the global north. So this is just to put into perspective where the Pacific is or where Fiji is. people have been asking me, how long did it take you to fly from Fiji? Because there are direct flights from Fiji to go to the US, but because they were all booked, I took a different route from Fiji to New Zealand, which was 3 hours, and New Zealand to Houston, my first entry point to the US, which was 14 hours. So yes, long flight, but we're really close to each other based on this map across the ocean. Briefly about Fiji, you can see the Union Jack, the British Union Jack. We were ceded to Great Britain in 1874 and got our independence back in 1917. But we still carry that Union Jack as part of that historical memoir that, you know, at one time we were part of the British colony. Those pictures on our current flag also implies that at one time we had a thriving agriculture industry. Our country, Fiji, was exporting sugarcane, copra, banana, that has sustained our economy at a time, for a while, until recently when we shifted and we started to focus on tourism. Fiji is made up of 330 islands, 110 of which are inhabited. We have a land area of about 7,100 square miles, which, like I said in the presentation earlier, very close to New Jersey, 73,000 square miles. While we have a population around 930,000 people, 56% of this are indigenous like me, 38% are Indo-Fijians. Indians were brought in during the indenture system when the British had colonized Fiji, and 6% are Europeans, Chinese, and other Pacific Island countries who have moved and lived in Fiji. We love our food. Coconut trees, coconuts are part of our daily sustenance back at home. You know, when I got to San Francisco, because we were very close to the ocean, the first question I said was, I don't see any coconut trees around here. They told me, go to LA and you'll find palm trees and probably some coconut trees. I went to LA and they showed me palm trees, but I thought it was similar. The land context in the US was similar to ours. But then I realized over these past couple of weeks how different the land area, the land mass, the geographical context is, and also how I've come to appreciate our small island countries. We love rugby. Love rugby because I think we've won 2 gold medals in 2 separate Olympics. And this is significant for small countries like ours because we hardly make it up to the medal tally in those big games. But also, because we were still young independently, we've had 3 military coups already. 1987, the first coup that took place in Fiji, 2000 and 2006. And because it brought tensions among the different ethnicity groups, the sports of rugby was the only way people could come together. It was the only place or space that people could talk about what they were going through. They were able to sit together in the room and cheer for their national team. And we've tried to use this concept of sports, they're using the sports to create awareness, to bring together the different communities, but more so in advocating for different social issues. So that's briefly about Fiji. If you ever come to Fiji, try something with coconuts. So you can at least know that you have been. They will always say this. If you haven't tried this back in the islands, then you haven't been really in the Pacific. Eh? So there are different dishes known for the different places, different islands, but they are all done from the natural resources that people have access to. From Fiji to the Northern Pacific. Now, when I was invited to be part of this program, I was wondering what could be one thing that makes the connection of the Pacific to the US. And we have this history, not so good history, but a history that has played a part in how we've viewed not only the US, but also how we're now engaging in different spaces. So one of our shared history that have continued to have an impact in the decisions we make in our engagement with other countries was this particular event that took place between 1946 and 1958. We already, people might think your relationship with US probably just started, some years back, 10 years maybe or 20 years. But based on this history, we've actually had partnership or that bilaterals with the US long before the conversations around climate started. So these were tests done, nuclear testing done in one of the islands in the Pacific, the Republic of the Marshall Islands. There were 67 atomic bombs, nuclear bombs that were done in this particular place, Republic of the Marshall Islands. While it had impact on health issues, babies were born to women who were jelly bean babies, deformed babies. Communities had to be displaced, had to be relocated because their whole environment were contaminated. The environment itself was affected, was polluted. So the people could not live there anymore. The first picture shows the testing that took place on the island. And the second picture is a concrete structure that was built to cover or to bury all the debris, all the equipments that were used in the nuclear testing. The fear now is, because of sea level rise and the soil and the coastal erosion, that particular structure is eroding, and there's fear that the nuclear wastewater might leak into this ocean, near the islands. But because we've seen in the earlier map that the ocean connects everybody, then it exposes everyone to the risk of nuclear contamination. And this is particularly important for us in our engagement in the work around climate justice, because there's already conversation about transition from fossil fuel to other alternatives. And because of not only the experience that the Pacific has had, I guess everywhere else around the world there may have had some experience in relations to nuclear testing. How do we learn from our history or our past to inform our future better? And for us, because there's conversation around phasing out fossil fuel and to invest in renewable energy, there's already talks about nuclear energy as one of the alternatives. And for us, because of this history, we're finding our footing carefully, or putting our footing carefully, because we wouldn't want this issue or the impacts to be a generational one based on the decision we're making today. So the decision to go for nuclear energy is now a contested issue, at least in the Pacific space. And as people were trying, still trying to recover from the impact of climate change, nuclear testing, repositioning themselves, rebuilding also in the new places that they had gone to, then we are faced by the impacts of climate change. I said earlier, the churches were the first institution to be approached by communities. Now, in 1960s, when the nuclear testing was happening, the churches met in Malua Theological Seminary, another island in the Pacific, Samoa, and they realized, okay, we've taken the gospel to everywhere else around the Pacific, but now social issues are coming up. How do we address social issues while at the same time continue to build, the different faith communities that are now have heard the gospel and have received Jesus as their Lord and Savior? So the church leaders decided, let's create this institution to deal directly with social justice issues. One of the social justice issues was the nuclear testing. It was the church, along with students from universities, other communities, who set up the Free Nuclear Pacific campaign. It started from the church started to talk about it, provided the space for communities together and talk about their fears and also how to handle these issues. When that happened, when it came to climate change, they found that this methodology was also useful. Let's use the church's platform. Now, we continue to hear communities at the coast, from the coastal communities, also those in the highlands. A lot of our islands are maritime lands, so they may be exposed to more um, more exposed to the impacts of sea level rise. So those who would plant, would have their agriculture, their farms along the coast, on the islands, are the ones who are most affected. The fisheries, those fisher folks. A lot of our communities are, when you are a farmer, you follow a traditional agriculture calendar. Fisheries, we call them wanamindau, a traditional role that they can read the currents, the waves, they will know where the fish will be. But as time moves on and as they realize the impacts of climate change, all these started to change. They were trying to figure out, okay, is the traditional calendar still appropriate or still useful given these impacts of climate change? Because they can no longer plant their food now on the grounds, on the land. Sea level rise, seawater has entered into their groundwater system, affecting their groundwater system. Therefore, they cannot plant their food. And secondly, because the ocean is warming, coral bleaching is happening. A lot of the people who rely on the fish has migrated further out into the ocean, cooler temperatures. So what happened was, it poses a lot of pressure to a lot of the farmers and the fisher folks. They now have to find other ways of dealing with providing food for the families. And because a lot of mothers, a lot of women are the ones who gather fish, gather food for the family, this also contributed to a lot of gender inequality. We are still patriarchal now society in Fiji. So often the women don't sit on the table to make the decision or share their views. When they are the ones that goes out to gather food, they don't often have the space to share their context also or their experiences in going out, even with the impacts of climate change. So the church, through this work, had to identify, okay, we recognize that there's a patriarchal society. How do we then provide space for women to have their say? But as all these issues are interconnected, more and more pressure is posed on the community themselves, because they find it difficult to provide livelihood for their homes. Therefore, the impact on sending children to school, they couldn't afford that. And then the health issues of water. Warmer temperature brings a lot of mosquitoes, therefore dengue fever and malaria becomes an issue. We've had recently where our Ministry of Health is stating the younger people are finding it difficult to breathe, asthma, the increase in asthma cases, respiratory illnesses. And because in our context, there was not a space to talk about mental health, which is something like a new issue for our community, it took us 5 years to unpack what mental health looks like in the context of the Pacific. Because we do not have a word that describes mental health or defines mental health. Secondly, the mental health has always had a negative connotation to it, which means it was difficult for people who are working in the area of climate change to really break down what mental health looks like in the context of climate change. These are just some extreme weather patterns. When we are, as communities, we have a cyclone season from November to April. I listened to what was happening in the cyclone recently in Florida and other places nearby, and I'm wondering, this is the same case we're facing. While the US might have a big landmass, for us, strip of islands or small island countries, when you have a strong winds of Category 5, that probably might come at a route, and you might think only one community or few communities along the coast are affected. In fact, the whole island might have an impact of this one cyclone. This is one of the community in Coral that was devastated in the last, the Winston, tropical cyclone Winston. The biggest Category 5 that has ever hit the South Pacific. And now we continue to experience that the cyclone route has changed. The usual route that our meteorological officers would tell us, we are now recognizing that because the ocean is where the formation of these cyclones are happening, it shifts a lot in different places. And now because we've already heard, scientists' reports are telling us, you will be experiencing intensive and more frequent weather events. I believe, I'm not sure about the US, but we're feeling that impact. 2 or 3 cyclones in 1 year. In 2020, while people were recovering from a cyclone that hit Fiji in January of 2020, by April, another Category 5 hit Fiji. And so it was between January to April, and then in December, another cyclone hit Fiji. So 3 cyclones altogether in 1 year. And as people are recovering from one cyclone, they have to prepare again for another cyclone. So the cycle of preparation, recovery, rebuilding, preparation, recovery, rebuilding. While people are still recovering and rebuilding, another cycle, they have to prepare for another cyclone. This is in Vanuatu last year, and they had 2 cyclones, one after another, in 2 weeks. So one cyclone came in 1 week, the following week they were surprised that another cyclone was ready to hit them again. So these are some of the realities that our people are facing, and communities, which in some cases even our governments are not ready or are not sure how to handle the pressure from these extreme weather events. A lot of Pacific Island countries rely heavily on the fishing industry, and so because we know the warming temperature, coral bleaching, ocean acidification, a lot of our fishes are moving out to cooler temperature or other places to find their habitat or ecosystem because of the extreme weather events, but also the changing temperature. We also realize, and this is where our concern is, that our governments might resort to something environmentally would impact our environment as well. So their alternative would be deep sea mining. There's conversation now in Fiji and the rest of the Pacific, or even around the world, about blue economy. How do we extract from the ocean? We've talked about, there's already the conversations around green economy, where we are extracting from our land, and we've done that. Now there's conversation, how about exploring the ocean? Let's dig up the ocean, the deep sea mining. So our concern is that if our governments see that this is happening, the decrease in the fishing industry, to sustain some of our economy, they might resort to deep sea mining, which from our learning and also research that he's done, the ocean doesn't have any borders, which means if we're going to dig somewhere around the Pacific Ocean, it's going to affect everyone else who are linked to the ocean. So yes, while we are trying to push or address an issue on one hand, we realize that there are alternatives available, but how do we maneuver through this alternative that it doesn't cause more impact, environment impact to us? Decrease in biodiversity, we recognize our flora and fauna affected because of the changing weather temperature, rainfall patterns, and so their habitat or ecosystem are affected. So either they are endangered, or in the next couple of years will become extinct. But we are also at the same time recognizing there are more invasive species breeding, being brought by these climate impacts, because they are now identified or seen in most of our Pacific Island countries. And like I said earlier in the service, sea level rise is projected in the next 50 to 7 years to rise 20 inches. And for us in the Pacific, 2 inches, that's 20 yards or 50 yards of our coastal lands, homelands, being eaten up or being covered by ocean. I specifically chose this picture because this is one of the communities we work with. These are their grave site. It's already in the sea. Only during low tides then you will find the graveyard. During high tide, it's all covered. All these places were land before, where the children or the families used to play, and their graveyard was located on the land. Only 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the water continued to rise, and then sooner or later they found that their graveyard is now covered underwater. So those are this is just one of the many stories of communities that most of their ancestrally land, gravesites, and homes have to be relocated because of sea level rise. I talked a bit about the work the Pacific Conference of Churches did. The three declarations that I wanted to highlight are the Osintai Declaration that came out in 2004. Because the churches realized we cannot handle this issue specifically for one country. If we talk only about Kiribati, it's not only about, because the impact of climate change affects us disproportionately with Kiribati and other Pacific Island countries. How do we bring all these voices together? So the Osintai Declaration became the outcome of that conference. It highlighted the impacts of climate change, acknowledging witnesses from communities that have experienced climate change. And two, they recognize that we need to identify partners whom we can work with. One of the key areas we wanted to highlight was the support is needed, but we wanted people to create more awareness where they are. So we recognize the role of the UN space that the meeting that happens every year, the COP meetings. Our ecumenical partners around the world, the church partners, faith-based, World Council of Churches, our governments, international governments even, regional partners, civil society organizations, regional churches, and most importantly, the communities. How do they all play a role in responding to the impacts of climate change? 4 years later, the Namoumou Declaration came out because, like I said, discernment of churches stating there's no urgency out there. We've been talking about this issue for 4 years now, at least from the church. There seems to be no movement happening, or no urgency or ambitious targets to reduce, some of the calls, some of the requests from the region. And not only the Pacific, but all other small island states around the world that were experiencing climate change. So the end result of that conference was the Namoumou Declaration. Moana is ocean in the context of the Pacific. And so the Moana became the guide or the framework. If any of the communities in the Pacific was going to approach the church, their member church, they can at least use this declaration to guide how they were going to respond to the communities who wanted to relocate. And lastly, the Tuakoele Declaration. Tuakoele means who is my neighbor in the Tuvaluan language. We look back 20 years ago. We recognize there were partners that we identified. There were already partners that we were engaging with 20 years ago. Now, as we sit on the table in 2024, who else are our neighbors that we have not invited them to the space? And we recognize, okay, we've been talking about financial institutions who are putting money into these different industries. Can we invite them onto the table? We recognize corporations for the big movers and shakers in a lot of the UN negotiations. Can we invite them into the space? Because already we were singing to the choir that were already doing the work. How do we involve those who may not see this as a priority or as a not urgent issue? So the Tuakoele now is the current framework that we would use in the next 5 or 10 years. So this has established how the church was not going to only work with communities, work through the churches, member churches, to address issues in the communities and support them, but also the engagement with the leaders, our government leaders at the regional and the global space. Then we move down, or we zoom down to the relocation work, where a lot of my work has been focused in around the last couple of years. And this is, I think it's critical because I've been hearing a lot of conversation about migration. And I think people have not realized that there's going to be a lot more wave of migration happening in the future because of climate change. It's already happening internally in some countries. There's going to be more wave migration externally from other places. And I often ask, in Australia and New Zealand, when I have audiences now in the US, the people in the US ready to receive this wave of migration? migration because of climate change, yeah? Which is a difficult topic to talk about. But these are already conversations that people are talking about in the Pacific because the migration is happening internally. My focus on this particular case study is on these two communities. This is Fiji. The main two islands are Vitilevu and Vunulevu. We are based on the main island here, Vitilevu. Majority of our project on relocation has been done in the second biggest island, Vunulevu. Because we already have this declaration, the Moana Declaration, to guide how the church was going to respond to communities who will want to relocate, we were fortunate that that had put in place at least some space or some pace for the church to be approached by the government when the first community approached the government to relocate. So the two communities are Vunidongoloa and Vunisarusami. Vunidongoloa community along the coast of Vunulevu, 122 people, number of people in the village, 26 houses. Remember, a lot of our village communities, they still live in extended families. So maybe 26 houses, but there could be 3 or 4 families in one house. And in 2007, they approached the government to relocate. What happened was, every time there's high tide, water would approach the land, the whole village, would flood the whole village. And as it floods the whole village, it poses threat to the communities, risk health issues, water sources were affected, their food, and this happens almost on a daily basis because every time high tide comes in, it would flood the whole village. They approached the government in 2007 to relocate. When they approached the government, because the government did not have anything to work with the community, a framework or a guide to use to work with the community, they approached the church. One of the reasons they approached the church too is because the whole community were Methodist. And there was a question of faith in the negotiation between the community and the government. The questions that the community were asking was, would God approve of this decision that we were making? Majority are Christians, eh? I mentioned in the service, when 80 to 90% of people in the Pacific are Christian and indigenous, the framing of how they see issues will always come used by these two elements. My Christian views on this, and also as an indigenous. And so to ask the question whether God is part of the process, the government couldn't answer that question. They had to come to the church to respond to this. And for us, because there was already a document, we had to unpack that document to realize that this was now a reality. How do we activate this document that we already have? Now, the other issue was, because they were indigenous, and their ancestors were no longer around. So the question of whether their ancestors would give approval for them to relocate, because they were supposed, in their duty as indigenous, to safeguard and protect the land and pass it on to the next generation. Now that they feel like they failed that part, it was a struggle to understand whether this was a good decision for them as Christian and indigenous, but also whether they have failed their duty to protect or safeguard what was given to them. Because of those two questions, the government could not respond, and so they had to approach the church. We had consultations with the different groups in the community. We had to talk about their fears of moving. Why? Because they had lived on this land for years, and so leaving home is quite a sensitive issue. You probably would need to, try and keep convincing, but then for them it seems like we were, imposing to them to move because the risk of being exposed to climate change is far more greater than losing home and land. And so it took 7 years for not just the government, the churches, to work with the communities and other stakeholders to relocate people. In my story back in the service, I talked about how the community, had their final service on the day of the relocation. They prayed together, they mourned together in the church service in the old site. And as they moved, what happened to the truck. And for them, that was the significance that Yes, they may have left the village, but they hold back, they're still connected to the land. So this is the new site that they had moved into, more elevated. Everybody had the same design of homes. What happened was, because we had consultation with the women, whoever built this house did not include the kitchen. The women said, no kitchen, no food. We can build the house, but we're not going to cook until, and these are all new things that we have to learn, but also have to be considered in other plans that are coming up. Remember, there are 48 other cases of relocation that needs to take place in Fiji. We're prioritizing 23 right now that the government is focusing on. Anyways, one of the ladies who moved into the new site said this: I can no longer dream in this new village. I miss the sound of the waves breaking onto the foreshore, because this is not a new place for me. This is a new place for me. I miss my home. And plus, you go to every Fijian homes, you'll see mats spread on the floors. Women weave mats. The whole community can participate in the weaving of the mats. They spread mats on the floor, and everybody is invited to sit on the floor. They always joke about this. If you come to some Fijian communities or Fijian homes, you will have couches, but the couches are just there for decorations. Because as people walk in, they see the mat and everybody sits on the mat. Anyways, so she walked into her house and she didn't see her mat. She said this: I feel like I don't belong here. I don't see my mats anywhere, nor do I see that this is my home, even though there were new homes built for the communities. So the connection again of people to land, place, and what that belongs to them. And because a lot of indigenous do not have just the identity as Francis from Fiji, works for the Pacific Conference of Churches, we are the extension of our land and our ocean. Some of us have sacred trees, sacred birds, sacred fish, sacred animals. And when we relocate people, what happens to this other identity that makes up our community or makes up our identity? Communities relocated, and because this was the first one in Fiji, it was trial and error for most of us. We had to learn to also adapt as we go to other villages. The challenges were the loss, the trauma from the loss, from leaving the old site. There were challenges for the older folks in mobility, moving from one place to another because the place was on the elevated place. Competing interests of young and older generation. They are coastal community, fisher folks. They understand traditional skills, weather practices, where to go and fish. Is it going to be a fine day today? Just by reading the winds and the currents. And so to move inland means losing that knowledge and those skills. Now, a younger generation started to realize we don't really need to keep up with that traditional knowledge and skills, because we've now moved inland. That is no longer part of our community or identity. Fishermen and women commuting to fishing, because now they've moved inland, traveling back to the ocean was not only a difficult issue, but also the security of women going a bit further distance away from their village. So they had to go in groups to keep each other safe. And because the community had moved to a spot now, relocated to a land that is closer to other services, towns, cities, and along the road, the danger of children exposed to road accidents, but other social issues that arises from now being able to access other services or closer to towns and cities where they will mingle with other people. The second community is Buni-Savisani. I find this community always unique because they were exposed to this particular to the risk of climate change as well. Like Buni-Dongolo, they continue to have them every time there's high tide, the water floods into the village, again posing risk to communities, health issues, food and water issues. But the reason why they choose not to relocate, they are protecting the ancestral ground of the paramount chief of this particular province. There are 14 provinces in Fiji. Each of these provinces have a paramount chief. And if you have a responsibility to a paramount chief, that gives you your identity as well, your traditional role, plus it gives you a sense of belonging, sense of being part of that particular province. And for this community, because of that important role, they chose not to relocate. What they decided was, we will just ask, or we will just request the 4 houses that are most exposed along the forefront, along the beachfront, to move to the back of the village. They did relocate the 4 houses. What happens was, there were challenges again as the 4 houses were relocated. Landslide, because they were now closer to the place that was clear for road infrastructure, which exposes the 4 communities again to the landslide, to disconnection from the whole community. 3, again, the challenges that the younger generation, should we continue to protect this ancestrally ground? Is it even worth it at the expense of communities being exposed to the impacts of climate change? So those are some of the challenges that we continue to face. The community continue to face, and we've seen younger generation identifying themselves, to relocate elsewhere without seeing the importance of the traditional role to the paramount chief and the community or the province as well. So we come back to the question of how shall we sing the Lord's song in foreign or strange lands and strange times? Because for us, strange times are the frequent cyclone that we're facing now. 3 cyclones in 1 year, that's very strange to us. Flooding or storm surges, king tides that used to happen twice every year is now happening almost every month. That's very strange. And strange land, because the land that we used to plant our own food on, that our ancestors would plant on, are now not able to for us to harvest our crops from. We can't plant any more food on this land. We can't get our fresh drinking water anymore from this land. So we continue to find, okay, what are other songs that we can sing? Songs of hope in the face of all these impacts of climate change. I specifically chose that picture because it was drawn in May of this year. I talked about how Tuvalu, a small island country, has appeared in so many climate change books, and there's prediction that by 2030 it will no longer exist. So that particular picture is saying Tuvalu was here. And if that island submerges, what happens to the people of Tuvalu? Will they still call themselves Tuvaluans? Or are they going to be accepted in the place where they will move to? What identity will they take with them? This is probably the question that we continue to ask ourselves, unpack, as we talk about climate-induced migration in the Pacific. Back to where we work. Because this is critical in engaging the communities who are, like I said, Christians and indigenous, the pastoral, the prophetic, and the practical are very key in our approaches. We recognize the important role the church plays in these spaces. It is not only influential, it can also shift and mobilize people to engage in this work. The prophetic is only our advocacy, continuous advocacy, not only with other partners around the world, but even so with our government. This is interesting about the Pacific. We can be sitting in our conference rooms at different sides of the table with our government on an issue. But when it comes to regional and global platform, our government, civil society, and churches are together on one side of the table, because we know we all represent the voices and the concerns of the communities we represent. And speaking truth to power is one of I think the most unique role the church plays in our context. Showing up to tell our stories, changing the narrative. We may be vulnerable, but we're finding solutions from within the work that we do with communities, and also using the pulpit as our space or platform for advocacy. Our pastoral goes both ways. While we're assisting communities on one side of the table, on one hand, supporting them, through the support that the Presbyterian Church USA is offering. Thank you very much for that. On the other hand, we realize our accompaniment cannot only go with those affected. We need to also accompany those who are making decisions that's causing this impact. So everything that we do at community level informs our posture with our government leaders. It's important for us that we continue to be the soundboard for our government leaders. Whether it's on climate or any other issues, how does the church show up to tell our leaders that policy is not going to work? It needs to, it needs to change. It needs the voice of all these different groups. That's important to us. Because at some point, we've reached the point where the churches or the government would reach out to these churches to verify some of these informations. And lastly, the practical bit. If we need our prophetic, at least for us, and our pastoral to work, our practical work needs to be really grounded, because this informs our engagement at the prophetic level, our political spaces, and the pastoral work that we do. We realize sometimes the leaders would ask us, what have you done? Have you done anything about this thing? So at least we have an answer. Yes, we've tried it. It has worked. This is an alternative that you can use, or the stories that we can share with them to change not only policy but also change their mindset towards responding to the issue of climate change. And last but not the least, the reweaving of our ecological mat. Like I said, in all the homes in Fiji, you'll find a mat. In this work, each of us represent a strand. And because climate change is not a standalone issue in the Pacific, it's interconnected to health, food security, water, and migration and other things. Each of these strands are woven together. In the end, there's a big map that we're spreading, and we're trying to figure out how to address all these issues. And so, to conclude, all of us here are weaving different mats, different priorities, different experiences, but in our concept of mat, we spread the mat and invite people to sit on the mat to laugh together, to share the meal, to mourn together. But at the same time, as we sit on the mat, we look around. Who else is not on the mat? Have we missed somebody who should be invited to sit on the mat? Should we extend the invitation to others to sit on the mat? Which I've seen over the last couple of weeks while going around the US, that not only the Presbyterian Church were in the room, but others as well. So the concept is moving. And last but not the least, our sharing. When we sit on the mat, sometimes the mat is not enough for everybody. So I'm sent to my auntie or my grandmother to borrow their mats, and we spread the mat. And each of the mat overlaps, which means also, as the concept of sharing, that what I might think is mine is actually not mine. It belongs to my whole community. So whether if I go out and probably pull fruit from this particular tree and see all other fruits, I will only take what I need, because the whole community can also have access to the fruits that's available. So I want us all to imagine that I'm spreading this imaginary mat and inviting you all to sit on the mat with me while we weave all our different stories and experiences and contexts to fight for climate justice. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. I don't have any questions. All right, well, thank you to Francis for coming. Appreciate it.